Okay, so thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Stina Lisa Tilcock, and I am a reference and outreach librarian here at the Sutro Library. I also want to thank our speakers, Onnika and Diana, for being with us this afternoon and for their willingness to share all of their insights and thoughts with us. So thank you so much, the two of you. For those who are not familiar with the Sutro Library, we are the rare book and antiquarian library of one-time San Francisco Mayor Adolf Sutro. After Sutro's death in 1898, his heirs gifted his library to the state of California in 1913. You'll find us on the campus of San Francisco State University, but we are a part of the California State Library located in Sacramento. After joining the State Library, we began collecting family history and genealogical materials, and we now have one of the largest genealogy collections west of Salt Lake City. We also put on about 4 genealogy and local history events per year. And today, for our third event of the year, of course, we're straying a bit from our usual genealogy fair to offer a special peek into the rare book side of our library. We will have another genealogy event coming up in December, however, so please stay tuned for more details about that. To get notified about future events and stay up to date on Sutra Library happenings, you can subscribe to our quarterly e-newsletter, and the link for that will be available in the chat. And for today's event, we also created a survey through Microsoft Forms available at the link again in the chat. And at the end, we ask you to please fill this out as it helps us with our future programming. We, as I said, will paste the link in the chat, and then we'll also email it out after today's event so you can access it later. Lastly, events like this one would not be possible without the California State Library Foundation. So a big thank you to them for helping us put on this series. So just some housekeeping before we begin. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the State Library's YouTube channel shortly afterward. If you have a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box, and we will read questions out to our speakers at the end of the presentation. For the rest of this presentation, the chat function will be disabled. So please use the Q&A box instead for all questions. Closed captioning has been enabled. You can look for the CC symbol on your Zoom screen in order to use it. Please note that these captions are being auto-generated. Finally, if you run into any technical difficulties during the presentation, please send us a message, again, through the Q&A box, and we will try to help you if we can. And now that the housekeeping is out of the way, let's get on to our main event. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's presentation, a special collection showcase around the theme Age of Aquarius, featuring 2 staff members at the Sutro Library, Onnika Dunkerly and Diana Kohnke. Onnika is a student assistant at Sutro, a museum studies student at San Francisco State University, and a library and information studies student at San Jose State University. Diana is an instruction and outreach librarian at Sutro Library, where she has worked for over 13 years. She also holds master's degrees in history and library science, and she is an Aquarius. Diana and Onnika both have experience curating exhibits at Sutro and beyond, and for today's presentation, they worked together to select a unique set of items from the spookier side of our rare book collection, exploring topics such as astrology, astronomy, spiritualism, folklore, and witchcraft. On your screen, you'll see images taken directly from these items in our collection. Remember that each of these books is available to be viewed in person in our reading room by researchers, astrology fanatics, the casually curious, and everyone in between. And if you'd like to know more about this, stay tuned because I'll share some more information about how to visit us and request to view rare books at the end of this presentation. Now, to get us started, before we dive into some of the really juicy items we have prepared, I'd love to hear from both of you, Onnika and Diana, about your choice of theme for this showcase. So what drew you to explore the Age of Aquarius through Sutra's collection?
Hello, thank you so much. Yeah, so originally when Diana came up with the idea to showcase Age of Aquarius, I was immediately interested, simply because of a few reasons. I myself am interested in the odd and the macabre, and I thought that Sutro Library's collection served well for this function. There's a lot of great, interesting items that are free for anyone to look at, and I thought the potential for originally an exhibit would be a fantastic idea. I was also um, fulfilling some museum studies credits in which it would help me to curate an exhibit. So it basically served multiple functions, and then I just became extremely excited to continue the project and onward to continue the research.
All right, that's great. And then what about you, Diana?
I have always enjoyed this topic, and right now we're entering the age of Aquarius. And what a great way to showcase some of our really fun and unique items that are kind of spooky and just explore the different aspects of the age of Aquarius. A lot of social media people have TikToks and other things that dedicate hours to doing astrology. And so they've been talking about the age of Aquarius a lot. And I thought that, wow, that'll be fun for the library to do too. So I really just assisted Onnika, and it was a pleasure.
That's great. Yeah, it really is a super fun topic. So many juicy, juicy things to explore. And now I'd like to ask if you could give us maybe a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, and tell us a little bit about your thought process in selecting the items you did originally for your exhibit and then now for this showcase. So if you'd like to kick that question off, Monica.
Yeah, so as Diana explained, the Age of Aquarius is truly about change and evolution and progression. And so when we were looking at the collection at Sutro Library, there were a lot of topics about specifically what I'm going to be focusing on alchemy. And what was really fascinating about alchemy was uh, the progression of alchemy really started from folks trying to understand their natural world using their baseline religion. And then that spiraled into alchemy, and then alchemy fathered modern day chemistry. So it was really interesting focusing on the progression of how certain ideas evolve and change, which perfectly aligned with the idea of the Age of Aquarius on how things essentially change in our natural world. And it seemed also that this baseline became a common topic for other topics such as witchcraft and mysticism and magic, which also had similar evolution of people trying to understand their natural world using their baseline religion and then eventually it kind of evolved into a new topic and that's honestly how we get a lot of our modern day conclusions of science. And in terms of choosing the objects, it took some research to decide. There's quite frankly so much objects to choose from. It was really hard narrowing down what we wanted to showcase, but it really came down to essentially what images were very striking and also how interesting was the text with the images. So some items are really text heavy and some items are really image heavy. And I think we decided to come up with a really great balance on what is interesting to read and what is interesting to look at.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much.
A lot of my focus is on the Victorian obsession with Egypt, ancient Egypt, with spiritualism and the occult during the 19th century, both in America and in Britain and Europe. So that is what I'm going to be talking about today. There's a wealth of stuff in this library because Sutro himself was a Victorian man collecting books. And so there's kind of a lot of stuff on like New Age communes in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but many books on mediums and these sort of secret societies and brotherhoods. So it's a really fun part of the collection to delve into, and we have some just really great illustrated books.
All right, thank you. That's great. Yeah, and I think hopefully everyone will see, but I think the through line between some of these older topics from alchemy to Victorian spiritualism, I think really comes through in the items you guys selected. So you did a really fantastic job. So let's go ahead and jump into our first item, and I'm just going to introduce the items and talk a little bit about what you can see on the screen here. So this is a book from the collection written by Peter Apian and illustrated by Roman Lull. And it has some volvels, which will Onnika will explain a little bit more after I'm done what that means. But you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, there's an image of a globe with the axes labeled on the globe. And you see some Latin text at the top. And then on the left side of the screen is a very similar image, but the globe instead is in the middle with various different circles around it, I believe representing the cosmos. So there's a lot of different images like this in this book. But what we really want to focus on is the volvels. And these volvels um, look a little bit like this. So this is one image that we took from the book. And I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but hopefully as I go through, you'll see what it looks like. But you have this circle on a piece of paper, and then there's a second piece of paper overlaid, and that second piece of paper is attached in the center such that it spins. So this is what it looks like in one position. And then in another position, it looks like this if you rotate the point just a little bit. And then in another position, it looks like this. So it points in kind of 360-degree directions. So Annika, would you like to tell us a little bit about this item?
Yeah, great. So as what Lisa mentioned, Vovels, they are multiple layer of parchment attached via a string, and essentially one could tell theoretically their fortune or the weather patterns with the Vavels, but that's not how they started. Originally, Roman Lull, he was a religious scholar who was trying to understand his religion, and he was trying to create arguments for why his religion essentially existed. So he was trying to create patterns and basically a commune on how to mix scientific studies at the time, which were star maps and that sort of thing, into a religious chart. It's very vague. I don't really know if anyone specifically knows what he meant by that, but from that, other artists took inspiration, such as Peter Apian, who created the Volvels that you're looking at right now. Um, and he was not as much concerned with researching his religion and inserting that with science discoveries. He was mostly concerned with how these objects could be used to map stars and tell fortunes. Um, and Vels were heavily inspired by astrolobes, and astrolobes are essentially uh, these bronze little objects that you would point to the sky and it would map out stars. And some people used these on their ships and boats to travel. And that was eventually turned into these paper objects. So what does it mean by mapping out one's fortune? Well, mostly people were concerned about weather patterns and how that would affect their crops. And a lot of these items are actually either in Latin or Spanish or Portuguese, some kind of version of Latin, and so they're a little hard to read, but for the most part, that seems to be the main concern was how are my crops going to get affected through the weather? I mean, people wanted to eat back then, they had to eat, and that was basically the only constant that they had. Um, and eventually these became a major tool and were widely used. Sutro Library has a really rather large collection of these. I was quite surprised, but they're really fun to kind of spin around and see what they meant by it. And as you can see, some of these have like the astrology symbols, like there's Aries and Taurus and all these kind of fun things that people could use to map out their chart. But yeah, these were really fun to research on, and it's quite amazing that a lot of these are still functional and still attached. That was quite a surprise.
Yeah, it is. It is amazing given how old some of these items are. If I remember correctly, this book was published in the 1500s. So the fact that it's surviving. I also want to show everybody there. This is another Volvel that is located in the book. It's a little bit different. It looks like in the center, it is tracking the phases of the moon. but I wanted to give kind of a sneak peek into what this looks like. So the the circular image that you see of the Volvel, that is on one page. And on the back side of that page, if you flip it over, you see the second image on the right. And you can see that they left a space in the text, a little square in the text for the a string to be poked through. And then it looks like there's a little darker piece of paper in the middle to maybe reinforce where that is being poked through. I think this is a little bit funny because you can tell that it was kind of not placed correctly. It was a little bit off center, which maybe gives some insight into the challenges of printing things like this. But yeah, this is really, really great to see. Okay, so I can move us on to the next item if you're ready. And that is another item featuring our friends Peter Apian and Roland Bull. And you see three different images on the screen. One is an image of the title page with some text in Latin describing the title of the item. And then we also have a couple images of some kind of funny looking equipment. They're almost like very bulbous sort of jar urn looking things. So Annika, if you want to tell us a little bit about this and maybe give us some insight into what those things even are.
Yeah. Yeah, so what you're looking at is kind of hard to understand, but this is the first version of chemistry, essentially. These odd-looking little jars probably included some kind of liquid and they were boiling. That's what this like little castle looking thing is. Um, for who knows what reason, probably to find some kind of medicine or cure for something. These two folks right here, they're not considered alchemists, but eventually, which we'll get into the next object, the alchemists that came maybe 100 years or so after these folks were heavily inspired by them to create their own chemist labs that they consider as alchemy. So it's really interesting. This is eventually this is a good example of how even before alchemy there was this kind of mystical belief, and then it got turned into alchemy, and then alchemy got turned into chemistry. It's all very interesting.
Yeah, that's great. I love that kind of through line connection between all of these different practices. So with that, let's go ahead and move us on to the next item where I know you're going to get a lot more into alchemy. So this item is by Johann Rudolf Glauber. It's called the Miraculum Mundi, and what you see on your screen is again three images. We have the title page of the text describing again the author, the title, the year. These older texts tend to have very, very long titles because the title will often describe in a lot of detail what's in the text. And then on in the middle and on the right, you have two images. One where both of the images have some structures that look like maybe they're made of brick. One of the images has some dome-like structures, and then the other one has maybe some kind of box-like structures. So yeah, Annika, tell us a little bit about this and what's going on in here.
Yes, Johann. Yes, the first example of an actual chemistry lab, although he considered himself an alchemist. And I should probably mention a little bit about alchemy and alchemists and what that even means. So alchemists were interested in finding three main cures and elixirs. The number one was to create the Philosopher's Stone. Number two was to create an elixir of life. And number three was to transmute metals into gold. And sometimes alchemists believed this meant one thing. This meant like creating one single philosopher's stone that would cover all of your three bases, and the elixir of life and the cure to all diseases is essentially mixed into one. And some alchemists believed this is like three separate things. But either way, they all assumed that this was their main goal and purpose in life. And all alchemists were trying to figure out. It's kind of an umbrella term, but most alchemists were trying to figure out how to create those three things. Um, and so yeah, our friend Johann here, he specifically was trying to create the elixir of life, and that's what a lot of these jars and this essentially this lab is. Probably was mixing some kind of salts and solvents together. Johann, he did create some kind of some cures for late medieval Europe, I would say. And this was I don't believe we would consider this a cure nowadays, but he created this salt that people would consume, and the salt would purge out the disease that they would have. And we probably wouldn't consider that a cure nowadays, but to them, purging was the number one way of curing diseases. So that was his big accomplishment in alchemy. He believed he created this cure. But that being said, a lot of uh, future alchemists were then inspired by his labs to continue the practice of having a dedicated space to create some kind of elixir or philosopher's stone. But yeah,
Oh, right. Yeah. It's so funny to look at these images and think of them as a scientific lab. That's something that, seems a little bit silly maybe to us now, but it all had to start somewhere, right? Okay, so carrying on with the theme of alchemy and some of the things you've mentioned, like the Philosopher's Stone, here we have this little, very small pamphlet, and it's called Five Treatises of the Philosopher's Stone. In the image on the right, you see again the title page, and you can see from this that this one is a little bit, it's gone through a little bit of wear and tear throughout its life, and that is kind of reflected on the top. Some of the top of the page is a little bit worn down and missing there. But that is the treatise or the pamphlet that we have, and then we have taken the image of the symbol of the philosopher's stone from another item in the collection, so you can see this symbol up close. We have a circle with a triangle inside of it and a square inside of that, and then a dot inside the square. So Onnika, go ahead and tell us a little bit about this one.
yes, the Trees of the Philosopher's Stone. This English version was printed in 1652. There is a Portuguese version that was printed even earlier before that. But from this very tiny pamphlet that probably has 7 or 8 pages in it is actually where we get a lot of our beliefs on what alchemists actually practiced in. So to say loosely, this is a how to create the Philosopher's Stone. And also, what does that actually mean? It's very vague on what that means. It's interesting because the origins of this item basically came from the King of Portugal's at the time, which turns out was not a real king. Adolfo King, yeah, he never existed, or it might have been a fake name. But his servant went to find the Philosopher's Stone, and he found a man that said he would teach him how to create the Philosopher's Stone. So it goes through how to actually create that, which is essentially you have to combine four earthly parts, being you have to combine wet, dry, hot, and cold into a vessel. It doesn't actually mention what hot, dry, wet, or cold actually is, just says you have to mix that together. And then eventually you put that on a copper plate. You surround that copper plate in hot ash, and you wait months and months, maybe even years, and even then, maybe the recipe's not perfect, and there you go, you have the Philosopher's Stone, which actually isn't even a stone at all. It's actually an elixir that you would supposedly drink. So I feel like a lot of folks who have an understanding of the Philosopher's Stone actually comes from Harry Potter, which is really funny because originally that's where I thought it came from too. But it is interesting. It was actually an elixir of life that could also somehow change metals into gold. Yeah, very interesting. And yes, the item next to it is another book with a extremely long title that comes from a book about basically it's this guy who is trying to argue why the Philosopher's Stone must exist. And there he has this little symbol, which is the symbol that all alchemists use to represent what the recipe of the Philosopher's Stone will be. And it is a symbol that represents wet, dry, hot, and cold. Again, I don't know what earthly objects that is. I don't think they necessarily knew, but essentially you would mix all that together and you have the Philosopher's Stone and you have the cure to life. And once again, I think it's just folks trying to understand their natural world and why things did what they did, and um and eventually I mean, these folks spent their whole lives trying to understand why things did what they did. So it is quite interesting. Um, uh, and it's interesting that these studies actually evolve into something that we do use in modern day, such as chemistry, which our next object, which will be on Isaac Newton will explain how that could eventually evolve in its studies.
Great. Yeah. So let's go ahead and jump right over to that one since you mentioned it. So we have Isaac Newton here. On the right, you'll see a portrait of Isaac Newton. This is an engraving, a very, very detailed engraving, I would say. And then oh, I'm sorry, that is on the left. And then on the right, you have the title page of this particular book from our collection. Again, this one is also printed in Latin, as many of the scientific texts of the time are. So yeah, when I first saw this item, I was surprised to see Isaac Newton included in this list of kind of more alchemists and sort of what we would think of now as pseudoscientific practitioners. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about him and his like alchemy life.
Yes. So we all know Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, excuse me. He was the famed mathematician, philosopher, astronomer, physicist, all of the above. Uh, he based his chemistry off alchemy. And he was heavily inspired by the previous predecessors that we discussed earlier. His lab was heavily inspired by Johann and so on and so forth. But I think mostly the reason why we decided to display Isaac Newton was because we wanted to showcase how these beliefs could actually evolve to scientific discovery. Um, and Isaac Newton, he too was interested in finding the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of life and all the things that alchemists were interested in. While I was researching alchemy, I also found that alchemists tend to have been stewards of different studies, including history and math and art and the arts and music. And these were all qualities of a good alchemist for their studies. And I think Isaac Newton really does signify that. It's also really funny because Isaac Newton, we're all so familiar with the little apple tree myth, and it's also very interesting and fun. Um, but he's not necessarily described as being a great alchemist. I think partly because it's considered mysticism, but this did heavily inspire his chemistry studies.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. I'm really excited that you included this because it's so cool to learn something new about this person that we've heard so much about. Okay, so I believe with the next couple items, we're going to kind of transition into the discussion of a new topic, which will be witchcraft. So we have a couple examples here of a several volume set in our collection called Hammer of the Witches. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the title page of the first volume of the set, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see the title page of the third volume. These volumes are very, very text heavy, so unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of images to include. But Onnika, would you like to tell us a little bit about this book?
Yes, Hammer of the Witches is an extremely, I would say, daunting subject matter. It's printed in 1486, and it is one of the most printed books of its time aside from the Bible. I would say most people probably were ordering Bibles and then Hammer of the Witches next to it is probably what was happening. Um, it is responsible for the murder of of probably thousands of mostly women, but men too, because it essentially started the European witch trials. Um, and Sutro is lucky enough to have 3 volumes of this item. They're all connected. Volume 1 showcases how a witch is created. Volume 2 showcases how you can identify a witch, and Volume 3 showcases how to prosecute a witch. So Volume 1 was actually inside of these contexts. Volume 1 showcases uh, essentially, in order to create a witch, a individual, mostly a woman, has to copulate with a demonic entity. And that's how you create a witch. Volume 2, How to Identify a Witch, is actually quite sad, but in order to find a witch, you supposedly, oh, I'm sorry, it got dark, but your husband and the wife would probably have difficulties having children would be one way to identify a witch, and either what that means, either your wife or you're being affected by a witch is either a witch is near you. So essentially, if you're just having issues or having trouble um, giving birth. And number three, how to prosecute a witch. It's very common. It's a very common idea that most witches were burnt at the stake. Yet, most witches were actually hung. I believe the next image might showcase. Um,
Yes.
mhm.
Yeah. So I just, before I put this image on the screen, I just want to give everyone a quick heads up that this is going to be a more graphic image. So, yes, so this is from another book in the collection. And as you mentioned, it is a depiction of one of those executions that you were talking about, where witches are being hung and not burned at the stake.
Yes, exactly. This item right here comes from a book called Grievances of England's Grievances, excuse me. And it does showcase how witches, mostly women, were being hung rather than burned. Um it is quite a sad topic, I feel, but yet we felt it fit into the exhibit because it showcases how sometimes change doesn't actually necessarily mean discovery or even something good in most cases. It could really go in any direction. And the witch trials were ever growing. They continued well past this, as we're familiar with the American witch trials, which happened near 200 years later, since this is a late medieval object, early Renaissance object. Um, so it is something that was ever growing, yet it still follows the same theme of folks trying to understand their natural world. Why were things happening the way that they were? And they were trying to understand their own religion. Uh, the author of this book, which but I believe is Heinrich Kramer, he was affiliated with the church in some way, and so many folks were trying to understand how their religion can actually affect folks.
Yeah, and it's great too. I think even though this image is quite, as we mentioned, quite graphic and it's very, very sad, it is very good to see the real world effects that some of these beliefs had on people as they were going about their lives. So jumping on to our next book, this is also going to cover the topic of witchcraft. And this one has some really fascinating images. So on the left, you'll see a depiction. This is a scene from a story from the Bible, and I believe Onnika might tell us a little bit more about this. So I won't give too much away. And then in the center, we have the title page of this item. And then on the right side, you will see another image that is made up of basically six small images. It kind of almost looks like maybe a precursor to a comic strip to me, but each of the images is depicting a story that is told in this book. So Annika, tell us a little bit about this one.
Yeah, so Joseph Glanville, this item was printed in 1668. Yet, by that time, Joseph Glanville was since deceased, and he originally started writing his copy years before that. So this item actually came, what is it? It came 200, near 200 years after Hammer of the Witches, and he was heavily inspired by Hammer of the Witches, and a lot of the same themes are found in this item. Yet, Joseph Glanville had a different approach to why he actually decided to write this item. He originally wanted to write this item because he felt that if folks stopped believing in um, demonic entities, then people will eventually stop believing in their God. So once again, he's trying to connect his religion to like change and his natural world. And this item was fun to read just because it was in English and it was fairly easy to understand. And each throughout this item, he goes through different stories, different short stories, if you will, about different witch encounters. So the item actually opens up with this first print, which is a story from the Hebrew Bible on this king, the guy kneeling down, he was trying to pray to God and found no answers on how to defeat this army that he was trying to win. And so he decided, after multiple times, he decided to go to this witch who he asked if she could summon this war hero for him so he could commune to him in order to get a certain edge over the other army. And so she does so, and essentially at the end of the story, nothing quite goes well for any of these folks involved, and it's a cautionary tale on to not seek outside forces other than the God that you believe in. And I think it's very fitting that Glanville decided to pick this, since that's sort of the main topic of his entire uh well, I'm not sure if Glanville just picked this item, but whoever did certainly fit the theme of the item. And this next page right here, the one with the images, showcases a demonic creature, supposedly the devil, coming down to this building and reanimating this young boy who's floating up. Kind of fun, kind of silly. And throughout this book, it's actually the first mention of a witch's bottle and also a good witch, which was really kind of interesting and a little bit of a opposite twist. But um, I think it's really funny to mention because the way to protect your home from a witch would be, and also I should mention the way you would know if a witch was targeting your home would be you would have difficulties conceiving children. Once again, coming from Hammer of the Witches, but um but in order to protect your home from this evil eye, you would either, as the man of the household, you would pee into a bottle and fill that bottle with rusty nails, and then you would seal that bottle and put it in front of your home. And if that still doesn't work, if you're still having issues, then you would ask your wife to pee in that bottle and then do the same, fill it with rusty nails and seal it, and supposedly you're good after that. So, yeah, I mean, I guess if I was a witch, I wouldn't really want to go to a house with that in front of their door. So that's probably a good thing. Um, but this item was actually probably my favorite. I mean, I know we're not supposed to have favorites, but this item was probably my favorite to read, since it was easy, such an easy read, and the images were just so striking. So yeah, either way, learning about witchcraft, although such an emotional roller coaster, once you realize that, um thousands of people passed away due to this. And then this item right here actually inspired Cotton Mather's book, which inspired the Salem witch trials. So these items are not, I suppose, free of their evils. They all inspired people to do some horrible things in the real world, but all these people were very much trying to understand, we're very much trying to understand their own world around them.
Yeah, that is kind of a wonderful note to wrap this topic on. It just, the process of knowledge discovery being such a complicated and really thorny process. So we are now going to thank you so much, Annika, and we're now going to jump forward a few years and talk a little bit more about spiritualism in the Victorian era with Diana. So the first item that we're highlighting in this section is a book called The Rosicrucians. And you see on the left-hand side, there's the title page of this book with, kind of some symbols already giving you a hint into what is going to be in the rest of the book. And then there's a couple pages that I selected. There's a lot of little small illustrations in this book, a lot of different imagery, especially referencing back to the ancient Egyptians. There's a lot of, charts and circles and symbols and all that kind of stuff. So Diana, tell us a little bit about the Rosicrucians and what's going on here in this book.
So before I hop into the Rosicrucians, let me just talk a little bit more about the Age of Aquarius, what it is, and a little bit about the Victorian obsession with the spirit world. So the Age of Aquarius is a time of revolution and change and upheaval. this great age of harmony and humanity and justice. And it also signifies the rise and fall of empires. Think the last time we entered into this constellation is when the French Revolution happened, when the American Revolution. So it's this cycle, and it's actually called the precession of the equinox, and it's based on the 26,000 year cycle of Earth as it wobbles on its axis. And every 2,000 years, it passes into a different constellation. And so this is happening right now. It's also a time when the veil between the material and the spirit world thins and there's interaction, and it's sort of mysterious in this way. So, as I was talking about earlier, Sutro was a Victorian and he also had these interests. So we have things like this. We have books on magic and hypnotism and phrenology and all kinds of things you can think of. Of particular interest to the Victorians was this notion of communing with the spiritual world and the idea that you could talk to the spirits of dead loved ones. Everyone from Queen Victoria to Charles Dickens to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was obsessed with the occult and with holding seances and with fortune telling and ghosts and this whole world of mystery and magic. And I'm going to talk later about mediums, but they were mostly women and they were in parlors all over Europe and America. The Rosicrucians, let's just talk a little bit about them. So the Rosicrucians actually began around 1614 with the publication of some pamphlets, and it was an occult sort of philosophy that was born out of the Protestant Reformation. And it was this secret brotherhood, and the Rosy Cross was actually the cross of Martin Luther. And they believe that the spiritual as well as science, art, philosophy, and theology should all be together. The Rosicrucians, their central belief is in ancient, esoteric, secret knowledge passed down. And this also fits in with these icons and symbology of ancient Egypt. In the 19th century, it died out, but in the 19th century, with this increase in interest in the occult and with Napoleon's discovery, his army discovered the Rosetta Stone. There was this whole thing with Egypt. But the Rosicrucians, this occult kind of spiritual order, they are still around and they have a museum and a library and bookstore with actually some sarcophagi and Egyptian mummies in San Jose. So it's still this organization. And they consider themselves a group of philosophers ultimately, and their interests and they study things like the mystery of birth and death, the nature of time and space. Not just consciousness, but this idea of a universal consciousness, metaphysics, spiritual alchemy, as well as alchemy was a part of this tradition. Sacred architecture, psychology, mysticism, pretty much anything you can think of. It was all about these esoteric teachings and mysticism. Um, so we can move on to the next.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so before we jump on to the next item, I have a couple more pages from this book because there were just so many fascinating illustrations. This one on the left is an illustration of what they're calling the heraldic genealogy of the fleur-de-lis. So you see that kind of well-known symbol, multiple versions of it on the bottom part of the page, and then on the top part of the page, there's a lot of symbols of beetles. Could be maybe like a scarab beetle, which is a common symbol in ancient Egypt. So yeah, that was an interesting, I think, representation of some of what you were talking about. And then we also have another chart with all these different circles that are interrelating to each other. So yeah, lots of fascinating stuff. So we can go ahead and jump on to the next item, which is a pamphlet from our collection called Faux Hot. So you see the cover of the pamphlet on the left-hand side, it's printed on yellow paper. It's black printing on yellow paper. And it is this very, very striking engraving with, again, a lot of references to Egyptian imagery. And then you can see the first page of the pamphlet on the right-hand side. So yeah, go ahead and tell us a little bit about this one.
So this actual entire publication printed in San Francisco or published in San Francisco is actually dedicated to um, a medium and Russian mystic, Madame Blavatsky, and some of the other issues of this have articles by her. And as you can see, it's featuring Egypt because in 1922, Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered. And so there was another revival of Egyptomania is what they called it because people were truly obsessed with everything Egypt. They wanted like icons in their houses, they wanted furniture decorated like it. There are, tons of museums that are dedicated to it. So Madame Blavatsky is actually part of this like circuit of medium spiritualists of this Victorian era. And what I was saying before, mediums were mostly women. And one of the interesting parts of this is, well, they were thought to be closer to and more gifted with the spirit world. But they're also able to use this as a way to speak about issues that are important to them. So there's like this aspect of them being able to be sort of pseudo public figures that not only are they doing seances and things like that, but they're, going to say abolition and, voting rights for women. Although at this point they had it, so Madame Blavatsky, which, as I said, this magazine is dedicated to, was a Russian mystic and writer, and she founded what's another sort of occult mystical society called the Theosophical Society. And their mission is to, quote, encourage open-minded inquiry into world religions, philosophy, science, and the arts in order to understand the wisdom of the ages, respect the unity of all life, and help people explore spiritual self-transformation. She traveled around. She also considered herself, Madame Blavatsky, who, as I said, is this is dedicated to, considered herself a psychic, and she claimed to also have studied it with Eastern masters in India and Tibet. She really believed that the mystical way was the only way to achieve true spirituality and knowledge. And her first book, actually fitting in with this whole Egypt kind of mystical knowledge, esoteric knowledge, is actually called Isis Unveiled. Isis, the goddess of magic, motherhood, and healing, she said this very thing, that the mystical way was the only way. So yeah, as you see all the symbols that are very Egypt laden, this, as I said, the year when Tutankhamun's tomb is discovered, and it's this whole mystical idea of the world. And this belief in the afterlife and communing with the dead and the spirit world. Um, so I think we can move on.
Okay, great. Yeah, that is a perfect segue into American spiritualism, which is our next item that we're highlighting. So you have three images on the screen. On the left, you have an engraving, again, another very, very detailed engraving. And this is a portrait of the author of this book, Emma Harding. And then you have an image of the title page. The title page of this book is very, very fascinating. It has another engraving. This one has a depiction of Jesus kind of floating in the sky with kind of a ring of light around him. And then you see this pyramid in the background. So again, that symbolism that's very reminiscent of Egypt. And then on the right-hand side, you have a chart that was included in the book. And maybe someone in the audience can tell us a little bit about this. I could not make head or tails of this chart. It's really, really quite something. But yeah, anyway, so I will pass it back over to you, Diana, to tell us a little bit more about spiritualism.
So Emma Hardage was one of those traveling mediums, and she, along with Egypt, this was a craze with the occult and the Victorians. So, and for much the same reason, the Egyptians were incredibly interested in the afterlife, and their elaborate ceremonies and burial chambers fits perfectly into this world of spiritualism and the occult. And you have figures like Madame Blavatsky, very famous, and Aleister Crowley, who delve into these mysteries of life and death and of our place in the cosmos. And, it appealed to the elite and the working classes. The elite could have a private seance, and then the working classes could go and see one for a nominal fee. And it could be entertaining. It could also be a spiritual awakening. You never know. And you wonder why was it such a craze? Well, this is the Industrial Revolution. It was a pretty bleak time. There was 1 out of 5 in Britain, 1 out of 5 children never made it past 5 years old. Um, but it was also something that the church supported because this belief in the afterlife fit in to this idea that the church has of the afterlife. And so it was considered an appropriate and like allowable way for people to express mourning or whatever. And so it fit into that as well. It was so popular that at the height of spiritualism, there was literally one book on spiritualism published every single week, which is a staggering amount. And, it also offered escape from the factories and the mines, this idea of magic and things that there's a better world where your loved ones are. And so this whole idea fit into this kind of narrative. So she was also another founder of the Theosophical Society, along with Madame Blavatsky. And she also claimed to have actual natural powers and didn't want to do this at first, but ended up traveling around. And she was actually a big abolitionist and actually less than 48 hours. And she lived in Britain, even though it says American spiritualism, she is British. She gave a rousing funeral oration when Lincoln was assassinated, less than 48 hours. So she used her platform to also speak up for women's rights as well as abolition. And she was able to travel around in this world because of her giving seances and her public lectures and things. So it was kind of this other interesting way women could have some public voice. Um, let's see, is there anything? She did dabble in the occult a little bit as well. Um, so yeah, that's kind of it for Miss Emma.
Yeah, so we have on the topic of spiritualism, we have some more images to kind of give you, just illustrate a little bit more some of the things that Diana is talking about. So we have a couple of illustrations from one of the other books in our collection. The one on the left, on the bottom, the caption says, "Casting out the evil spirits." And you see kind of a surprised looking woman with a man who's pointing very forcefully. So maybe some sort of spirit is being cast out. And then we have on the right, at the caption says table tipping. And there's a woman who has a table a bit kind of askew in front of her, maybe demonstration of psychic powers and spiritual powers. And then these next images, again, are illustrating some of the, kind of practices and stories around this world. We have an image on the left of the caption says light heart dissolving, and it is kind of a fascinating engraving of this woman. Looks like she's very ghostly, looks like she's dissolving maybe from the bottom up. And then on the left top image says a clairvoyance view, and you see a man who looks like he's just absolutely surrounded by ghosts. There's all these little white figures of ghosts just everywhere. So maybe kind of overwhelming to be a clairvoyant, if it looks anything like that. And then the bottom image says the murdered woman, and we have a kind of again, a very dark, ghostly looking woman with maybe little wild hair who maybe looks like she's haunting an old spooky house, something along those lines. So lots of ghosts, and you were mentioning kind of the lifting of the veil and the commune between the physical world and the metaphysical world. So we see a lot of illustrations of that here. Okay, did you want to add anything else about that, or should we move on to
No,
the next
I'm
item?
good on that one.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, our next item here is called solar biology. So again, we have an image of the title page on the left. giving you a little bit of information about the author and the publisher. We have it's by Hiram E. Butler. In the middle, we have a chart. The top of the chart says positions of the moon for the year 1915. And this particular item, I believe, was published in the late 1800s. So this is a prediction of what you also see astrological symbols on the chart. So which different astrological constellations the moon will be in this coming year. And then the last image is another chart. It's a diagram of the sun and the solar system, again, involving astrological symbols. So tell us a little bit about solar biology.
So, Butler was an American occultist and also a member of the Theosophical Society. He developed this system of astrology with these pigeonholes, which were based, and I think that's what you're seeing is they're based on the natal sun and moon signs. He talks in this book about the relationship of the sun to physical health and human health, like for skin, for strong bones, and a healthy immune system. And he also talks about the history of sun worship and the cultural significance of the sun in history. Um, so that's kind of a lot about that. That's kind of that book.
Okay. Great. Yeah, one of the really fascinating illustrations that we found in this book where there's two separate diagrams. On the left side, you see a diagram of a female body, and then on the right side, you see a diagram of a male body. And each diagram has the various different astrological signs pointing to different parts of the body. So it kind of associating different again, those different signs or those different constellations with different parts of the body. And then I've also included the descriptions of each diagram on the screen, so you can see, yeah, this kind of, looking to the stars maybe for health and biological information. Okay, great. And then I can jump us on to, I know you wanted to talk about Aleister Crowley. So each of these images are not in Sutra's collection. We've actually
No.
borrowed them for the purpose of this presentation, but this guy fits perfectly into a lot of the things that we're talking about here. So you see Crowley himself on the left wearing this kind of very elaborate outfit. It looks like maybe he has jaguar skin draped over him, and a cloth wrapped around his head. And then on the right, you have a very interesting drawing. So I will let you talk a little bit more about that.
So he actually wrote a book on Thoth, an ancient Egyptian god. So he does look like he's in like some Egyptian attire. But I just wanted to mention Aleister Crowley. He is also born out of this tradition. He was associated with it's called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is like a related kind of organization to the Rosicrucians. And he became disillusioned with traditional religion. His father was sort of deeply involved in religion, and so he really became deeply involved in the occult. And I think this is so interesting. So he supposedly communed with this being from another dimension, another world called Lamb. But he looks suspiciously like what people describe gray aliens as looking like. So I thought that was really interesting. And that
It,
ends, I think, yeah. So he also kind of part of this whole Victorian tradition of the occult, of sort of things outside of traditional spirituality and religion. So,
yeah, really just such a fascinating sounding guy.
yeah.
Okay, and then our final item that we're going to highlight today is we're taking a little bit of a detour. I know that most of what we talked about today is based in either Europe or the United States, so we're going to take a little bit of a trip across the other side of the world to Japan and highlight one of the items in our Orentalia collection. So this is a Japanese scroll. It is currently not cataloged at the library, so we don't really actually know a lot about it. But you
Mm.
can see in this image, this is there's several illustrations contained on the scroll, and this is one of them. And you see kind of a um, group of beings sitting around in a circle. Some of them look human, and then some of them are cats. And then we have a bird, and they're wearing human clothing and kind of participating in this circle. So yeah, Diana, tell us a little bit about this one.
So yeah, this is just a little bit of like Sutro when he purchased things for the library he was creating, he would often either hire agents or go to auctions and buy an entire lot of stuff. So this is probably part of a lot that he picked up that has other scrolls, but thousands of Japanese woodblock prints from the Edo period. And so, as Celia said, none of these are even really cataloged, so we don't know a whole lot. But in general, the rich folklore of Japan has these creatures that are human bodies with the heads of different animals, and they are supernatural beings. And the cat, for example, is known to be a shapeshifter and a trickster figure. Um, and also is known to be able to speak. Um, so that's another thing, speak human language. So we just wanted to, we actually have some other folklore that we have on display, but we just wanted to give a shout out to some of the supernatural that is in our Asian collections. Um, that's all I have.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think maybe one of my immediate thoughts from hearing both Annika and Diana's discussions is just this, really long, complicated process of trying to understand the world around you and how some of these questions that people have about life and death really resurface again and again. You see the alchemists of the 15th century trying to answer some of the same questions that the Victorians of the 19th century are still grappling with. Uh, so it's really, really great to see kind of that through line through history. So once again, thank you so much, Annika and Diana, for this fascinating look into Sutro Library's spooky side. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, all these items and more are available to view in our reading room. So if you thought this talk was interesting and you'd like to see more, all you need to do is make an appointment at least 3 days in advance on our booking website, and that link will be appearing in the chat shortly. And if you're interested in finding out what other weird and witchy items we have in the collection, you can also search our online catalog. The catalog has the entire holdings of the California State Library. And when you search, just make sure that you select Sutro Library to see what is here with us in San Francisco. And
Oh,
finally, yeah, Diana, go ahead.
we also have a Halloween YouTube video that it features our spooky books, including the skull.
Oh, yes, we do. That's true.
Yeah.
So definitely check out our YouTube channel and take a look at that because that will have some great information about some of the spooky stuff that we did not get to talk about this time around. But don't worry, there's more. There's lots of spooky stuff. And finally, if you need any assistance at all with making an appointment or searching the catalog, please email us. Our email is available on our website, and it's also, we just dropped it in the chat. We'll be very happy to help. And of course, we're always available for any sort of questions. One thing about librarians is that we love questions. We love a nice, juicy research question. So definitely don't be shy about reaching out to us. So now, before we wrap things up, I would love to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please make sure to type it into the Q&A box. I know that maybe some questions are maybe still stewing, but we have a couple of questions that came in during the presentation. So I will go ahead and start with the first one, and this one is for either of you, Diana, Diana or Hanukkah. I've smashed your names together. Um, so the first question is, was there any reference to the invisible college in any of these?
No, but I'd
Not
like to know more about it.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I couldn't find anything about that in any of the sources, but that does sound very interesting.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Maybe this would be a good research topic to see if we have anything like this in the collection. Okay, so this question again is for both of you. And this person wants to know, do you know Latin and do you translate any of these texts not written in English?
So I do not know Latin, unfortunately. The good thing about some of these texts, is that a lot of them are available in English already translated, and there's plenty of different versions of these texts are translated, so you could kind of like cross-reference, like, oh, is that accurate or is that accurate? Um, and also another great thing was that a lot of the references I used specifically with the witchcraft, a lot of them were in English already, so I was able to easily read that from the original text.
I
Yeah,
do
great. Thank
not.
you.
I mean, yeah, I don't read Latin.
Yeah, that is definitely, I definitely don't either. And just to kind of add on to that answer is in general, we usually rely on kind of subject matter experts and scholars. If we ever do need to translate something ourselves here in the library, we will ask. There's a lot of folks at the university here at San Francisco State or just universities across California who are experts in this. So we definitely let them do that instead of bumbling through it. But yeah, the translations that exist online are definitely super helpful. Okay, so now I'm just kind of going through these questions in order. So if we don't get to your question, I apologize in advance, but we'll jump on to the next one, which is, were there other texts older than the Maleficarum that mentioned witches extensively?
That's a good question.
I can
I
answer that
yeah,
question.
Diana might have a better.
So, yeah, so some of the oldest books in the world are called incunabula, and they're from approximately the invention of the printing press, so 1440s to 1501, and it's really kind of Latin for the cradle of the book. So it's like the birth of the book. And we have 58 of those books, so 1501 and earlier. And those are our oldest printed books. They're some of the oldest printed books. And we have older books that are are written, so they're manuscripts. They're, by scribes or whatever, like a book of hours, for example.
Yeah, so off the top of your head, do you happen to know if any of those, like maybe any of the ones that we have, mention witches? Maybe some of those incunabula or the manuscripts.
I don't think so at all. No, there's a
Okay.
lot of philosophy, as you can imagine. There's
Mhm.
kind of one of the first like printed music scores. It's religious. So yeah, it's mostly like theology.
Yeah, and just to
Okay,
add to
I see.
that answer, a lot of the Bibles reference I guess like demonic entities, and that's probably the closest you'll get to specifically witchcraft, but maybe some old Bibles.
Okay, yeah, wow, interesting. Okay, so jumping on to our next question, what are these engravings carved into? Now, this is a great question, and it's probably going to be different for different items, but I can go ahead and say that at the throughout the time that a lot of these items were printed, some of them would have been engraved into wood. So probably some of the older items, this is what was happening, where the engraving was carved into wood and then pressed onto paper. Some of them are also were etched into metal, so maybe some of the more detailed ones, I would guess. Yeah, do either of you know a little bit more about these kind of printing techniques for images like this?
Mostly like a lot of the were steel engravings, and then
Hmm.
put the ink on. But I mean, that's wood. Some of the earliest ones are wood, so they're carved into on copper, and it really just depends on the materials that they have available.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of different techniques and practices, but those are, like you said, those are some of the more common ones, the wood and the steel engravings, especially for some of the Victorian 19th century items. Probably a lot of those would be steel engravings. Okay, great. So, well, we are really moving through these questions. This is exciting. Okay, so this is an interesting question, and it is: was Adolf Sutro a practicing occultist, and why did he collect these items?
I do not believe he was, but he might have been like interested in, I mean, everyone was interested in the occult for a time. It was just sort of fun, it was like parlor games. Um, So I would say not necessarily, but he was probably as interested as everyone else was. Um, he wasn't a member of like any society that I know of.
Yeah, yeah, his collection is very interesting. Also because he collected very, very broadly. We have books from a huge range of topics. Some other famous book collectors had picked certain topics that they really wanted to hone in on, or certain types of books. And Sutro was a very, very broad collector. And he also collected very heavily in the natural sciences. So my guess is maybe these were kind of related to that interest. But yeah, it is kind of interesting to think about how these particular books made it in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is how much of Hollywood's portrayal of witchcraft is accurate?
That yeah, I would say maybe it depends on the interpretation, uh, and what accurate means. For example, I would say like Hocus Pocus is like probably not very accurate or something like that. But at the same time, honestly, the folks who kind of prosecuted people for being witches, I don't really think they necessarily knew what that actually meant. So, um, it kind of just depends um on the actual, I guess, era that they're depicting in. Yeah, there's some really great horror movies where I'm like, wait, that actually kind of like combines like the Witch, that movie. I feel like I saw a lot of that in Hammer of the Witches, but certain other movies may just be for fun. So it kind of just depends. I think i- overall though, both aspects are there's kind of a horror to it. So yeah, it just kind of depends, I guess.
Yeah, the witch being such a mythical figure is there, there's so much different, yeah, there's so many different stories out there that it's really hard to pin down. Okay, so our next question here, I believe this question is for Diana. Is the society you mentioned the Theosophical Society?
Yes, it's theosophical.
Yes. Okay, great. Cool. That was an easy one. Okay,
Yeah.
so this one, this one is also related to the Theosophical Society. And this person says, I know the Theosophists had a campus in San Diego, Point Loma area. Was there any references to this place in the spooky occult found in your research?
No, but it does seem like Madame Blavatsky was pretty like active around these parts. But no, I didn't come across anything.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder too. Our sister library in Sacramento, the California History Room, I know also does have some more occult materials. So I wonder if this might be mentioned in some of their materials as well. That might be interesting to look into at some point.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. And then jumping on to our next question. Do you know of other early scientists other than Newton who might have used alchemy to help in forming the science of chemistry?
Certainly some of the folks that I mentioned, such as Johann, was probably one of the earliest and best example of that. But if we're thinking late Renaissance, early Victorian era, I'm not too sure. Um, but I mean, I would assume not most, sorry, excuse me. A lot of folks around Isaac Newton's circle probably would have practiced something similar.
Yeah, I know. In actually the book American Spiritualism, we didn't include this image, but there is an engraving included of Benjamin Franklin. So I think he's obviously a little bit different, different branch of science than Isaac Newton, but yeah, he's definitely part of that world as well. Okay, so we have a couple more questions here. I think we might be able to go through them. Let's see. So the next question, Anton Levy or Levy, I'm not sure how this one is pronounced, was set up here in San Francisco. Any notes on him? Was he really demonic, or was it just a cheap show for money?
Who?
Anton Levy, or Levy
Oh,
spelled,
Anton LaVey.
oh, LeVay. Okay, my apologies. Yeah.
Oh, he's much later. But he basically founded the Church of Satan, but it isn't about Satan more than it is about like enjoying life and like, it's not as evil as people said, but I don't really know too much about him.
Yeah, and I'm guessing based on the time period that he was active, our collection definitely is stronger in the 19th century than it is like moving forward. So my guess might be we don't have too much about him, but it's always worth giving the catalog a look and seeing what you can find. Okay, and then our last question that we have here, of course, if you have more questions, we have a few more minutes, so please feel free to keep putting those in the Q&A if you'd like. So our last question is, does the Sutro Library have any items that feature information about non-Western witchcraft outside of the possible Japanese scroll example that we shared earlier?
I don't think so. There might be some stuff in travel books that we have, which could, but I mean, it would be a Westerner's like mention of it, but we have thousands of these travel books or travel narratives, and they date from the 1500s on up to, um, I mean, on up to the present, really. We still have stuff that we're getting, but there might be like mentions of that in like Chinese folklore, or maybe like there's stuff Africa, Jamaica, like maybe there's stuff on the supernatural in that, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, and just to add on that, there's some uh it looks like Islamic spiritualism also, and um some uh fiction books that may kind of talk about spooky stories of that kind of thing.
I am another librarian here, but I know that if you like broaden the scope of witchcraft to like mysticism in general, we do have some Islamic and Hebrew texts that like deal with Kabbalah and like saying the names of Allah and stuff.
Okay, great. Thanks,
Great. Yeah.
Tracy.
Thank you for jumping in, Tracy. Yeah, Tracy is our cataloging and metadata librarian. And I know she's been working a lot with those texts. So that is yeah, a great addition. And then the last thing I think I would add is, just because it's such a large collection, is that we might have some materials in our Mexicana collection. We have a large collection of Mexican pamphlets that I would maybe, they're copying, they're I would say majority of them are political pamphlets and covering major events of the time, but it's possible that some spiritual practices and things like with witchcraft might be mentioned. But that is kind of something, I think this is a really good topic to bring up, because that is one of the, challenges of working with a collection that is, it's the heritage of, it was collected by a Victorian man. He was a white male, and he was very interested in I would say gathering certain perspectives, and so that heritage has been kind of passed on to our library. So we do have a lot of Western perspectives, as Diana said. Even the books that we have that talk about non-Western places were primarily authored by Western people. So, that's something that we contend with a lot as librarians, but definitely I think if you go looking, there are probably hints here and there of kind of more, like I said, spiritual occult practices in different places, like the places that each of us have mentioned. But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so it looks like that is all the questions that we have. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of your fantastic questions. That it's always
Thank
exciting
you.
to get such juicy ones. Yeah. And of course, if you have anything else that comes up later that you'd like to ask us, please don't be shy about sending us an email, and we'd love to take a look at that and see what we can do. So I want to give a final thank you to Diana and Onnika, and I also want to thank Tracy. Tracy has been helping us out in the background with
Thank
managing
you.
the Zoom. Yeah, so we really appreciate all of the work that you all have done. I'm so excited that you both are interested in doing this presentation and sharing some of your knowledge with us and some of the really hard work that you do every day. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
And yeah, of course. Before we wrap up, I have just a few final announcements. Please, I'd like to remind everyone to fill out the survey. We will drop the link in the chat again so that you have it. This really helps us prepare for future events and know how we did on this event, which is it's always good for us to know. And don't forget to sign up for our quarterly newsletter so you can get notified about upcoming events and happenings at the Sutro Library. And finally, if you'd like to visit the library, we are open Tuesday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. by appointment. And we're open to everyone, members of the public, researchers, whoever would like to visit, our door is available for you. So all you have to do is make an appointment on our website. And if you need any help doing that, please send us an email. We'll be very happy to help you. So once again, thank you to our magnificent staff. And thank you so much to all of you for attending and making it all the way
Thanks.
to the end here. We appreciate it. All right. Goodbye, everybody.